end of the war. Okay? So on this map, this is Pyongyang, our capital. And here, this is Seoul, the enemy's capital. And there is the CLAS parallel like this, which was the demarcation line at that time. So at the beginning of the war, on June the 25th, 1950, the enemies, they intruded into our territory more than 1 or 2 kilometers along the CLAS parallel. But as I mentioned before, our soldiers frustrated this sudden invasion and they went over to the counter-offensive. So on June the 28th, 1950, we liberated Seoul. Later, we advanced to the south, and on July the 20th, 1950, we again liberated here this city called Daejeon. And it was the enemy's provisional capital, so it was a very important place at that time. And it was a very successful battle, and here in this battle, we also captured alive the division commander. He was general, and he was also captured alive in this battle. And as I mentioned before in our mission, there's a big panorama, and that panorama shows mainly the battlefield of this city. Okay, so we will see that one later. And here, this one is the river Rakdong, which you saw in the painting, where the crossing battle was. So our People's Army crossed this river and finally drove the enemies into these limited areas until September 1950. So from beginning of the war to September 1950, our People's Army could liberate more than 90% of whole territory of South Korea. But from September that year, the enemies, they began to mobilize larger forces on the Korean front, especially the larger forces from America and also from 15 other countries under the name of UN, including England, Turkey, France, Australia, New Zealand, Philippines, Poland, and so on. So with these larger forces, they conducted a larger-scale landing operation here in Incheon. So while attacking along the river Rakdong, the enemies, they conducted a larger-scale landing operation here in Incheon. So what they intended was to block the way of a retreat, so that they could encircle our main force here in this area and to annihilate them completely. That was a very difficult situation, and there was also great disparity between the balance of the two sides at that time. So the Grand Leader Comrade Kim Il-sung, he set was the new strategic policy that was to make the retreat. Not just a retreat, but it was strategic retreat in order to set the main force which were to be encircled here in this area. So at that time, under the command of the Grand Leader Comrade Kim Il-sung, our soldiers here in Incheon and Seoul, they fought well, and they delayed the enemy's landing operation 14 days in this period, and greatly contributed to the planned retreat of our main force. So our main force could successfully retreat to the north, and unfortunately at that time the enemies, they occupied several parts of our country, including Pyongyang as well. So on the map you can see the red lines are up there, so those are the final defense lines at that time. So the enemies, they intruded up to there. But even though in such a difficult situation where we are making a retreat, our people and army, they prepared well for the new counter-offensive. So under the command of the Grand Leader, here in the enemy's rear, second front was formed, and in the occupied areas, guerrilla units were organized, and in the northern areas of the country, 12 new divisions were organized. So from October the 25th, 1950, our People's Army, together with the Chinese People's Volunteers, they began to frustrate the enemy's attack again and went over to the counter-offensive. And in cooperation with the units who were in the enemy's rear at that time, and also the guerrilla units, we liberated all those occupied areas. And until June 1951, we completely drove all those enemies out of the country, again south of the 30th parallel. And from June 1951, the front was mainly stabilized on the 30th parallel. And from July that year, the enemies, they began to suggest about the armistice negotiation. But the main purpose was to gain time to prepare for the new offensive behind the scene of this negotiation. So the war lasted 2 more years from then, and finally on July the 27th, 1953, the enemies, they signed the armistice agreement, and the 3-year long Korean War ended. I just briefly explained, so is there any questions? No? If not, we'll move.